And welcome to this special edition of the Melissa J Show. My name's Melissa J, and this is my co-host, Melissa J Jr. Recently, it's come to my attention that comedian Dave Chappelle has had some less than flattering things to say about transgenders. Unfortunately, I don't speak for the transgender community because they think I'm weird too. Not because I'm transgender, but because I recently started dating a piece of fried chicken. Although I may not speak for the transgender community, I do speak for myself, and on my own behalf, I would like to respond to Dave Chappelle. You're an idiot, and the arguments you've presented have more holes in them than inexpensive Swiss cheese. For starters, there's this idea that having a baby is what defines a woman as being a woman. What is this, 1955? I don't know how to break it to you, old man, but times have changed. This is rock and roll. This is my generation. And not for nothing, but aren't you supposed to be cool? You know, Rick James, turn up my headphones. How come when it comes to transgenders, you've decided to transition into the grouchy old guy from the neighborhood? And you're all like, get off my lawn, you kids and your genders. After all that talk of rebellion, now you're suddenly yearning for a more traditional time on the American landscape when men were men and women were women? Now, I know this is going to sound weird coming from me, but you've changed. What the hell happened? Do you realize that as transgenders, we don't recognize you? And you have no idea how confusing this is for us. We're like, is that the same guy? Now, as far as your assertion that things are going so well for LGBT people that you feel a need to put the brakes on our little party train, look at what happened at the Pulse nightclub just a few years ago. 41% of transgenders have attempted suicide at one point in their life. 41%! And the rate is even higher among teenagers. And then there are incidents like what happened 4 years ago in Missouri to a transgender by the name of Allie Steinfeld, who had her eyes gouged out and her genitals mutilated while she was still alive. Then her body was burned by a group of people who bragged about it later, and according to the local district attorney, this was not considered a hate crime. Now, if you feel that any attempts to stand up for LGBT rights are somehow disrespectful to the black community, then that's on you. And please forgive my co-host and I for being completely unimpressed with your quote-unquote logic. Not to mention the glaring stupidity of the idea that having a friend in a particular demographic makes it okay to make a hobby out of taking cheap shots at them. That's the same thing that white people used to say, like back in the 70s. Now, as far as Daphne Dorman goes, much like you, I was appalled by the things people were saying to her on the internet in the weeks leading up to her death. I don't agree with cancel culture, and I certainly don't like the way they treated her or anyone else who they have a disagreement with. And while I can't speak for her experience during those weeks, I can speak for mine. I came out of the closet over 7 years ago, and I've been on stage constantly ever since then. And in all that time, I have never seen trans bashing become a socially acceptable public sport like the way it did in the fall of 2019. People were yelling at me out of car windows, saying rude things to me in the supermarket, and at one point I even had to leave an open mic because I was about to be on the losing end of a fistfight with a group of angry comics. They were drunk, they were pumped up on your special, they were mimicking the things you had said on stage, and they were ready to take it to the next level. My leaving had nothing to do with being offended or with political correctness. It was about self-defense. And before anyone tries to hang that PC snowflake label on me, much like Daphne Dorman, I love filthy and raunchy comedy, and I have a body of work to prove it. But something else that I also love is not getting beat up. Now, I know you're a good person, and I know those weren't your intentions when you put out that special, but there's a reality that you've never seen, and it needs to be addressed. Because when I got back to my house that night after leaving the open mic, I almost broke my hand on the kitchen counter because I was punching it so hard in anger. Comedy means everything to me, and I was feeling so upset about not getting to perform and about the things I had seen comedy inspire people to do in the weeks leading up to that I remember wanting to kill myself more than anything. But I just didn't know how to do it. And lucky for me, I don't own a gun. A few days later, I found out that was the exact same night that Daphne Dorman had committed suicide. And I remember thinking how death was at my door that night as well. I just didn't know how to let them in. So there are two sides to the debate you've started about Daphne Dorman. While she had the trans community yelling at her, we have the rest of the world yelling at us, like you, for example. And while I don't agree with the way that people spoke to her, what's been lost in this conversation is that a lot of those people who were typing mean things to her on the internet have been lined up on the roof to jump off right behind her, but just for a different reason, like me, for example. So if you don't like your friends committing suicide, neither do we, and tempers can flare in both directions. So maybe it is time that we all start learning how to get along. And to any Netflix executive who feels that content like that doesn't translate into real-world harm, I am lucky to be alive to be living proof that is not the case. Now, if I would have ever met Daphne Dorman, her and I probably would have been good friends and had a lot in common about how we feel about stand-up comedy and the right to free expression. But as far as her opinion that talking about us like a bunch of circus freaks is somehow a way to humanize us, that is an opinion that I strongly disagree with, as does the majority of the transgender community. And while she had a right to feel how she felt, your idea that the opinions of one transgender are somehow a binding social contract that the rest of us are forced to unwillingly adhere to is some of the stupidest and most asinine logic I have ever heard in my entire life. That's like saying that Candace Owens speaks for black people. Now, as far as the topic of being offended goes, I will say that out of all of this, ironically, the only thing that I find offensive are any attempts to take those specials off the air. I do not agree with the idea that cancel culture has, that it's okay to use censorship as a way to silence anyone who they have a disagreement with, and that somehow these people are enemies that should be hated by everyone. One thing that cancel culture needs to understand about the First Amendment is that free speech is like anal sex. It has to hurt just a little bit sometimes. That's part of the beauty of the experience. I'm a little upset about some of the things I heard in those specials, but I will go on record and say that Dave Chappelle is not a bad person. I still respect him as a comedian, and when it's all said and done, I'm still a fan. Because sportsmanship is one of the cornerstones that this industry rests upon. People need to understand that comedy is like boxing. It's a contact sport, but it's never anything personal. And we're going to continue to say whatever we want because you can't cancel an art form. You can only make it a lot more boring. But just because boycotts and cancellations are the wrong thing to do, That doesn't mean that people like Dave Chappelle are doing the right thing and they get to act like they're on a morally righteous crusade to save the planet just because they're ignorant. Duh. Like I said earlier, the arguments that Dave Chappelle has presented are like Swiss cheese. And as progressives, all we have to do is look right through the holes in them, and we can see a much brighter future for transgenders without having to resort to censorship and sodomizing the First Amendment in the process. Because free speech is a beautiful thing and it should never be compromised. In the same way that the forum of stand-up comedy is the cause of this problem, it can also be the solution. So on that note, I would like to say directly to Dave Chappelle that when it comes to this issue, you're a backwards Stone Age moron putting hundreds of thousands of innocent people in danger with your childish stupidity. And watching you trying to take Daphne Dorman's death and turn it into a welcome mat for your perverted obsession with us will go down as one of the tackiest moments in show business history ever. And then thinking that somehow a trust fund is going to make all of this okay? I'm sorry, but throwing a bunch of money at a problem that you've created and then patting yourself on the back over it is as white as it gets, and that's coming from me. And since you're so obsessed with other people's genitals, you know what you can go and do to yourself. There. Now, do we all see how much fun free speech can be? Sticks and stones. And to everyone watching at home, apologies about the combative nature of this particular video. Normally I'm not this way, but just remember that if you were on a playground and somebody started pushing your friends around, you would stick up for them too. And to all you badass Chappelle fans who after watching this video are suddenly going to start getting offended by things that people say, just remember that insult comedy is also like anal sex. It's not so funny when it's going in the other direction.